Hi everyone, and welcome to Elbow Lake Environmental Education Center's second virtual public outreach event for the summer of 2020. We're very excited to have you all with us this evening for the Introduction to Our Wild Pollinators webinar with Dr. Jessica Forrest from the University of Ottawa. Elbow Lake will be hosting virtual outreach events bi-weekly this summer, so please stay tuned on our website and social media for future events. My name is Megan White, and I'm one of the Outreach and Stewardship interns at the Queen's University Biological Station this summer. Myself, along with Lindsay Wright, our other Outreach and Stewardship intern, and Sarah Oldenberger, the Outreach and Teaching Coordinator, will be facilitating this event tonight. We ask that you would please keep your audio and video turned off throughout the webinar, and you can type your questions into the chat box. All of these icons are listed at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll be monitoring the chat box throughout the presentation, and we'll have a question and answer period about halfway through and as well as at the end of the presentation. Please note that we will be recording this webinar and it will be available afterwards on the CUBE's YouTube channel in case you have to leave early or you wish to share it with your other networks. To begin, we'd like to acknowledge the land that we are thankful to be situated on. Queen's University is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. Specifically, the Elbow Lake Environmental Education Center is situated on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory and is part of the Algonquin land claim by the Algonquins of Ontario, currently under negotiation with the federal government of Canada. Acknowledgement of these facts requires recognition of the pre-colonial history of this land and the peoples who lived here and continue to live here. The cultures and spiritualities of Indigenous peoples are connected to the land, and the land is an integral part of their ways of knowing and living. These knowledge systems are continually evolving in relation to the land and its other inhabitants, both human and other than human. The Kingston Indigenous community continues to reflect the area's Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee roots. There is also a significant Métis community, and there are First Peoples from other nations across Turtle Island present here today. We are very excited for this webinar, especially because Elbow Lake is in the process of creating pollinator and wildlife gardens on our campus. We are thankful to have received funding from the Helen McCree Peacock Foundation of the Toronto Foundation to help provide more habitat for these important species. We will be using flora that is native to the Elbow Lake area and supporting local nurseries in the process. If you'd like to follow along with our progress, please visit and follow the Elbow Lake EEC on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Without further ado, I'd like to take this time to welcome and introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Jessica Forrest is an associate professor in the biology department at the University of Ottawa, where her lab conducts research on the ecology and evolution of wild pollinators, especially native bees, and their interactions with plants. Jessica also teaches upper-level ecology courses, including a course on plant-animal interactions and an alpine ecology field course. In pre-COVID times, her and her students and her dog Oscar did fieldwork in Gatineau Park and the Colorado Rocky Mountains and on the agricultural landscapes around Ottawa. Jessica, we are very excited to learn from you, and I'll pass it along to you now.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you to Megan and Sarah and Lindsay for the invitation. I'm always happy to talk about wild pollinators, but I will just tell you up front that I have a bad habit of conflating pollinators and bees. So I will sometimes use those words interchangeably, even though bees are not the only pollinators in the world. Okay, so let's get started. I'm just going to start out with a reminder for anyone who hasn't recently taken a botany course about what pollination is and why we care about it. So pollination is the transfer of pollen from the male organs of a flower, the anthers, to the stigma, which is the female part of the flower. And this process, which is illustrated here with a tomato, if it happens between different plants of the same species, so that cross-pollination happens, then we get production of seeds, and that production of seeds will stimulate the growth of fruit. And so we tend to care about production of seeds for the regeneration of plant populations, and of course, we eat many fruits and seeds. This cross-pollination can be done by a number of different agents. So we've got an insect shown here, but actually a lot of our crop plants are pollinated by wind. Having said that, more than 85% of all the plant species in the world depend on animals for pollination. So if we were to lose pollinating animals, this would be a huge loss for ecosystems as well as for agriculture. So about 35% or more of global crop production benefits from pollination by animals. So the remaining portion, of course, are cereal crops, which are pollinated by wind, and there are some other crops that don't require pollination. However, even if 35% doesn't sound like a majority, it's not. It's the majority of the more interesting parts of our diet. So these are all fruits and vegetables and nuts that we consume. Oh, and there's coffee on there as well. I could have included cocoa. All of these are things that we get from the activities of animal pollinators that we would not have otherwise. So all of this color would be lost from our diet if we didn't have animal pollinators helping us out. So who are these pollinators? Well, the group includes a whole bunch of different animals. And in more tropical climates than ours, it can include a bunch of vertebrates. So there's even a lizard on here. This is a day gecko that is known to be a pollinator at the bottom here. In Australia, there are honey possums as well as honey eater birds. In parts of the New World tropics and elsewhere, there's nectar feeding bats. Around here, of course, we also have butterflies and beetles and moths, variety of flies. This is actually the midge that pollinates cacao. And in Africa, where they don't have hummingbirds, they have sunbirds instead, which are pollinating birds. So the whole variety of organisms can pollinate. In fact, even you could pollinate, and maybe some of you have. Really, anyone can do it. But the pollinators par excellence are the bees. And when most people think about bees, this is the species they think of, the European honeybee. It's a really fascinating animal. I'm sure you guys know something about it. Lives in enormous hives, is quite important for the way we do agriculture in North America and much of the world, and of course produces honey, which is nice. But I want to be super clear about the fact that it is not the only bee species in the world, far from it. And if you take nothing else from this evening's talk, please take this, that there are many, many other species of bees in the world than honeybees. And in fact, we have many species of bees that are native to North America, which the European honeybee is not. And so those are the species that I'm going to emphasize in this evening's talk. So just to put that in numbers, there are about 20,000 known species of bee in the world. And the honeybees, there's about 6 or 7 species of honeybees, and one of those is the European honeybee. So hopefully that puts it into perspective for you, that there's a whole lot of bee diversity out there, even in Canada, where we don't have tons of diversity. We still have close to 900 species documented, so pretty good range. Now, just to put that in some more context for you, in case you're not really used to thinking about numbers of species in different taxonomic groups, there are about 5,400 species of mammals in the world. So far more bee species than mammals. But there are about 350,000 species of beetles in the world. So the beetles really take the cake as far as insects go. This image here gives you a sense of the size range of bees. So Perdita, which is the little guy on the left, these are among the smallest bees, and the large carpenter bees are the world's biggest bees, at least by some measures. We don't have either of these genera in the Ottawa area, and I'm not sure if you guys have Xylocopa, the large carpenter bees in Kingston, but they do occur at least in southern Ontario, so around Toronto. You'll find them. Okay, so just one last reminder that honeybees, the European honeybee, as shown here, is just one species that I think we're all familiar with, but it's not the whole story when it comes to bees. So I think the next question that you might have is, how do we recognize bees in general if they're so diverse? And I'm going to give you first sort of a technical answer to that question, and then hopefully a more user-friendly kind of answer. And then I'll talk a bit more about bee biology. And and then we'll have a break after I guess I'll talk about bee biology and then some of the other pollinators. Then we'll have a brief break for questions, and then I'll talk about bee conservation, the threats that bees are facing, and what you can do to help bee populations. Okay, so what are bees in general? This image here shows the evolutionary tree of a subset of the wasps. And so there's a bunch of different wasp groups in here. Some of these might be familiar to you, some of them I'm sure are not. Ants are also in here because ants are technically a type of wasp. And then here at the bottom, there's this group called the Apoidea, which includes some wasps, like this one, as well as the bees. So in that technical sense, bees are really just a subset of the big group of wasps. A little bit more specifically, bees are vegetarian wasps. So most wasps, not all, but most, consume animal prey. So they're either parasites on other insects, or in many cases, they're predators of other insects. So this is kind of a typical solitary wasp lifestyle. It shows a wasp who has stung this caterpillar to paralyze it, and she is dragging it back to her burrow where it will stay fresh because it's paralyzed. It will stay alive, but not able to escape while the wasp larvae eat this meal that their mother has lovingly provided for them. So that's one way of doing things. Bees do things a little bit differently. So they've made a switch. So they descended from ancestors that ate animal prey like this, but they made a switch to getting their protein from pollen instead. In some ways, you could say, well, that seems like an easier way of doing things. You don't have to subdue and kill an animal. On the other hand, pollen has some traits that make it not so easy to digest. And actually, that's probably why not that many things actually eat pollen. The other thing that distinguishes bees from the other wasps is that they have branched hairs on their bodies. These are images of the branched hairs that you can see have been taken by scanning electron microscope. So this is zoomed way in. Clearly, you can't see this with the naked eye, but I promise you that all bee species have these branched hairs somewhere on the body. So that's how bee specialists, taxonomists, can recognize bees under the microscope and distinguish them from other wasps. And probably the branches on the hairs are an adaptation for carrying pollen. But like I said, that's not a super useful trait for most people going out in their yard and trying to determine whether an insect is a bee or a wasp. So I'm going to give you a couple of clues. Now, these clues are not going to reliably distinguish a bee from a wasp, but they will give you some indication that you're looking at a bee or something else that might look like a bee in your garden. So the big giveaway is if the animal is carrying pollen. So you're not going to find wasps around here that carry pollen on their bodies. They might have a sprinkling of pollen from having visited a flower, but not a big mass of pollen like this bee has in her pollen basket. Bees and wasps have elbowed antennae and two pairs of wings. So hopefully you can see there's two wing bases here. So these are the two wings on the one side of the body, and this is the wing on the other, one of the wings on the other side of the body. And that's a contrast with flies, many of which can look like bees and wasps. However, not all bees carry pollen outside their bodies, and if they do, many of them do not carry pollen in a pollen basket like that bumblebee was doing. So in fact, most bees carry the pollen dry rather than moistened in that sort of package like the bumblebee had, and they carry the pollen, instead of in a basket, it's on a pollen brush, also known as a scopa. And so this is kind of the typical position of a scopa on the hind legs of a bee, but some bees have the scopa on the underside of their abdomen. So you see that in leafcutter bees. And then some bees, and this makes them really tricky, carry pollen inside their bodies, actually in their crop. so like their esophagus, and then they regurgitate it to feed to their young. So these bees that carry pollen internally can look pretty wasp-like. The other important thing to know is that male bees do not carry pollen, because it's only the females that do the pollen collecting. Okay, so as I sort of alluded to in the last slide, bees carry pollen in different ways, and that can be related to how they look. So many bees are fuzzy, have lots of hair all over them, like this alpine bumblebee on the left, very fuzzy, and that helps with insulation. But then we have these yellow-faced bees that are relatively naked. And you can see there's a little bit of fuzz, and those are branched hairs on the body. But from a distance, this can definitely look like a wasp. I think most of us rightly tend to think of bees as being very hardworking, and that is true of most bees, with a couple of exceptions that I'll mention in a second. It's even true of queens when it comes to our wild bees. So you might have heard that queen bees don't do a lot other than laying eggs. And that's true in the honeybees, but it's not true in our native bees. So the bumblebees around here, for example, the queens have to be able to forage for food on their own and make a living on their own before they have any workers. So this is two images of queen bumblebees. And in fact, you guys have probably seen queen bumblebees over the last month if you've been outside at all, because this is the time of year when queens are out looking for a place to establish their nest. So this is probably a good time to give you a little bit of an overview of the life cycle of a bumblebee. So again, what you're seeing now are the queens that have emerged from overwintering. They're looking around. If you're seeing them flying low to the ground, not visiting flowers, but sort of poking into holes and crevices, they're looking for a place to make a nest. Once they've found that place, they will start to collect food for what will be their colony. So this queen will make a honey pot, and she'll go and collect nectar, bring it back, regurgitate it into the honey pot, and that will become a food source for her and eventually the workers that she will produce. And she also collects a pollen ball, and then she will lay eggs in that pollen ball and incubate them. So she can actually keep that brood a little bit warm. And then those eggs will hatch, the larvae will develop, and they'll eventually produce workers. And once the workers have been produced, and that's going to happen probably in a few weeks from now, you'll start to see workers coming out, and they're much smaller than the queen. And once they come out, then the queen no longer goes out foraging. So she's going to turn it over to all the workers to do the work for her at that point. The colony then grows through the summer, and towards the end of the summer, it switches from producing workers to producing a new generation of queens, as well as males. And those queens and males are the reproductives that will leave the hive at the end of summer. They'll mate, and some of you might have seen mating balls in the fall, where you might have seen one male or even several males grappling with a female who's much larger, as you can see in this image here. And then once that's been done, the males will all die and the workers all die. And the only ones who survive the winter are the inseminated queens. And so the queens go and they find some sheltered place underground to hibernate, and then the cycle repeats. Okay, so most bees are hardworking, even the queens, but there are exceptions. So there are a bunch of bees that are known as cuckoo bees, and this is one of them. And they often have this kind of waspy appearance, but again, they still have the branched hairs. And these bees don't collect any pollen. They still eat pollen at the larval stage, but they don't collect it for themselves. Instead, they take over the nest of another bee. So they'll find a nest that another bee has built, they'll enter it, they'll lay an egg inside, and usually that egg will hatch, and then the larva will kill the host bee's larva, and then it will eat the pollen provisions that the host bee provided. So much like a cuckoo bird or a cowbird does with a bird host. So it sounds unpleasant, but it's been a very successful strategy. And there's actually more species of these cuckoo bees than there are social bees. So I'll say a little bit more about social bees in a second. But anyway, this has been quite a common strategy that has evolved multiple times. And then the other bees that are not hardworking in the sense of spending all their days collecting pollen and nectar is the males. And so this is a male bee, and he's very cute, and he looks very alert, but he's alert for passing females. He's not alert to whether, in fact, the flower that he's sitting on is open, because it isn't. Okay, so I said I would say something about social bees, and social bees, I think, conform to our idea of what a bee is. We think of beehives, but actually social bees are a minority, a fairly small minority of all bee species in the world. So around these parts, we have a few social bee species, most noticeably the bumblebees, which have these annual life cycles that involve production of a small colony. And so much like a honeybee, they have the queen and workers, as I mentioned. They make honey pots. It's not quite as orderly as a honeybee hive, but it's got many of the same elements. But most bees are actually solitary. So about 3/4 of all bee species are solitary. And that means that just one single female works on her own to provide for her offspring. So it's not really that different from what we do, except that there's no actual interaction between the mother and her offspring. She just seals them in a room, usually underground, after having provided enough food to last them for a lifetime, and then closes them off and never sees them again. Okay, so this is an overview of sort of a typical life cycle of a solitary bee, although there's certainly variation. So as I mentioned, the adults, females, forage on their own for pollen and nectar, which they deposit in a brood cell, which they've constructed somewhere, typically underground, although there's some bees that nest above ground, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. So she provides this mass of pollen and nectar, lays an egg on it. That egg hatches into a larva. The larva consumes all the pollen and eventually pupates within the brood cell, frequently after spinning a cocoon, but that depends on the species. And then at some point, overwintering happens. It could happen at this stage, or it could happen at another stage. In any case, the seasons change, and eventually males and females emerge and mate, and the cycle repeats. Okay, so as I said, I am quite bee focused, and so that was the big long bee section, bee biology section. Now I'm going to say a little bit about other pollinators, but in much less depth. So some of the other pollinating insects that we have in our region include wasps, and there's lots of different kinds of wasps. The ones you probably notice the most are vespid wasps and sphesid wasps as well. If you want to know how to recognize vespid wasps, a group that includes the yellow jackets and the hornets, but also a bunch of very friendly solitary wasps that are not aggressive at all, they all have longitudinally folded wings. So if the wing is in a plane like this, they're folded like this. So it looks like they have these really narrow wings, but it's actually just they're folded. So these wasps, although they're probably not as important as pollinators as bees are, they can still pollinate because they visit flowers for nectar. And they do have some hairs on the body. There are a bunch of flies that visit flowers. In fact, flies can be some of the most important pollinators, especially at high latitudes and high altitudes, so in cold environments. And early in the spring here, there's a lot of flies that are really important pollinators. They're able to be active at quite low temperatures. The ones that you see most often on flowers are sometimes called flower flies. These are the syrphid flies, also known as hover flies, because they can hover in one place in the air. And many of them are mimics of bees and wasps. So they often have this yellow and black coloring. This one looks a bit like a honeybee in terms of its coloring and fuzziness. And they too can be important pollinators. Other flies that you'll see include bee flies, like this one, not related to a bee, but somewhat resembling a bee, and in some cases they parasitize bees. And then there are the tachinid flies and other sort of bristly flies that, again, can visit a lot of the early spring flowering plants. There's a variety of beetles that spend time in flowers, and some of them can be effective pollinators, although it kind of depends. A lot of the time they don't really move much between pollinators, so they're not between flowers, so they may not be doing a lot of cross-pollination. But there's a bunch of different beetle families that are pollen feeding, and so will be seen in flowers. And then finally, the butterflies and moths, which I feel like get more credit sometimes for pollinating than they really deserve, but they do visit flowers and they can be effective pollinators. And some of them are quite spectacular. I mean, I think people know that butterflies are beautiful, but we also have some amazing moths, including the clear-wing hawk moths. There's one shown here, which can even look like hummingbirds when they're in flight, and they fly during the day. You can tell that I don't take very many pictures of butterflies because one of the few that I have is actually a picture of a bumblebee, and there's just a skipper that happened to be on the flower at the same time. Okay, so I think that was enough of an introduction for you guys to be ready for a quiz. I made the quiz really short because I don't have any way of evaluating how you do. You're all just going to have to self-evaluate. So I'll just have to hope that you'll be honest about this. So if you're with someone else in the room, you can tell the other person if you think this is a bee or not. I'm going to give you 5 seconds to decide. Okay. So this is a bee. It's pretty wasp-like, but it's one of these cuckoo bees. So it doesn't have pollen-carrying structures, but it is technically a bee. And if we'd been able to zoom in and see its little branch hairs, we would have seen them. Okay, next and last quiz question. It's a really short quiz. Is this a bee? 5 seconds. So this is not a bee. It's a wonderful bee mimic, but hopefully you noticed it doesn't have those elbowed antennae. And in fact, it doesn't even have mouth parts at all. This is a botfly, and they are a whole lecture unto themselves. Fascinating animals. This one is a deer bot. The larvae parasitize the nostrils of deer, but it's not a bee. It just looks like a bee, presumably as a defense, protects it against birds that have learned to stay away from bees because they might get stung. Now, the reason bees are such wonderful pollinators is that unlike other pollinators, they depend on flowers throughout their lives. So the wasps, as I mentioned before, are mostly using animal protein to feed their larvae, whereas bees are using protein from pollen. So that dependence of the larvae as well as the adults on floral food is what makes bees so reliant on flowers, and it's what makes them such good pollinators. I think everybody knows that. We all know that flowers are important for bees. The other part that can get neglected is nesting habitat. So this is the other big thing that bees need to complete their life cycles, is a place to build a nest. And most bees nest underground. So this on the top left is sort of a typical entrance to an underground burrow. So sometimes when the burrow is active, you can actually see that's a bee-sized hole, and there's this pile of loose soil around it, but very often you can't see them at all. And so they're easy to miss, but they are all over the place. They're in your gardens. They're kind of everywhere there's undisturbed soil. Other bees, oh, this is another soil nest I should mention. This is a natural one that's been excavated by researchers just to show you how deep they can actually dig, even though they don't really have any special digging adaptations. That's a brood cell down there and another one down there. Other bees nest above ground. So they'll use existing cavities in dead wood. So if beetles have been digging through wood, leaving galleries. Once the beetles are gone, there's certain kinds of bees that will nest in those tunnels. And other bees will use hollow stems or even stems that have a center, but a pithy center that they can excavate. And that kind of nesting habitat can be simulated by you or by me. In fact, this is one of the nesting blocks that I've used in my research because these cavity nesting bees are willing to go in there, and then I can study them relatively easily. I can even pull out the nest contents, which look something like this, and I can study the development of the bees inside. And if you want to see some really great video and images of cavity nesting or twig nesting bees, this website here has some great stuff. Oh, the one other thing that I don't have an image of on here, but it's in the list, is the cavities that bumblebees will use to build to have their colonies. So it can be pretty hard to locate these hives, but bumblebees like cavities. So that can be an old abandoned rodent burrow. It can be a crack in a house. It can be a crevice in a stone wall, all kinds of places, and different species have different preferences. But yeah, you may have noticed these bumblebees poking around your house looking for cavities like that. So I think, I know I've already spoken for too long probably, but this is where I was going to allow questions before going through the second portion of the talk, which is actually a bit shorter than the first.
Awesome. We have a few questions. The first one comes from William, who's 10 years old, and they would like to ask, how long have bees been endangered?
That is a great question. Let me think about how to answer that. So in the next section, I'm going to talk a little bit more about bee declines. William, I'm afraid I'm going to give you an unsatisfactory answer, which is that it depends which kinds of bees you're talking about. But probably really it's just been in the last, I'm going to say 70 years. Not more than that, maybe less, depending on the species.
Awesome, thank you. We have another question from Ramsey, who mentions that lots of people are now encouraging gardeners to not tidy up gardens until later in spring. How important is this to bees?
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm going to talk about a tiny bit. Yeah, I think that is important. I can't give you a number, like how much difference it makes. I don't think it's really been rigorously studied, but it probably is pretty important. So a lot of bees, so basically all of our native bees spend the winter here, they don't migrate. And so many of them are going to be in those stems. So if you have like elderberry or raspberry cane, there could be bees nesting in that. And so if you cut back those hollow stems in the spring or even in the fall, you could be destroying nesting bees. So if you can give them a chance, into June, that would be helpful. I've certainly left all the dead stems in my yard, and I know my mother thinks it looks awful, but I think it's bee habitat.
Good to know, thank you. We have another question, Louis, so I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. They see a lot of people putting up mason bee houses, but that there's very little education around cleaning them. Yes. Are we doing more damage or good by putting these up and not cleaning them properly?
Okay, that's a great question. You guys are sort of anticipating the second half of the talk here, but yeah, so mason bee houses are tricky. So clearly in nature, mason bees don't get their nests cleaned out. It's not as though somebody comes around and cleans up natural nests. So in that sense, the cleaning shouldn't be necessary. But the problem is that we make these artificial structures probably attract more parasites than natural nesting cavities do. We don't have good data on that, but I think that's like, it's a good guess. We know that aggregations, so when you have a high density of bees in one place, that can attract parasites. And depending on the construction of the nesting block, it might be more vulnerable to parasite entry than some of the natural cavities. So are we doing more harm than good? I can tell you there's no good data to answer that question, but I would say don't do it because you think you're going to be saving bee populations. Do it because it's interesting and fun to do.
Good to know. Thank you. Our next question is from Carson, who's 4, and they ask, if wasps are meat eaters, what do they use nectar for?
Oh, that's so great. And I should have mentioned that. Yeah, so I didn't go into this, but basically bees and wasps need protein to make their babies grow. So larval bees, they start out small, bees and wasps, they start out small and they have to get big, and it takes protein to make that happen. And perhaps your parents have told you you need to eat protein to grow. And that's true for baby insects as well. So that's what the pollen or the meat is for. The nectar is sugar. And so they need sugar for energy, both at the baby larval stage and when they're adults. So adult wasps are taking nectar because they need sugar to give them energy. Does that answer the question?
I think so. I'll let you know if there's an update in the comments. Just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, feel free to answer them in the chat box, and I've been reading them out. So that's probably the best way to answer them, or to ask them, sorry. We have another question from Johanna. What bee species are used for agriculture?
Yeah, so honeybees are the main ones. They're the main ones that are managed. In other words, we can make them live in boxes, and we can move the boxes around, and they make these enormous hives of tens of thousands of worker bees. So that's really convenient for the way we do agriculture, where we have a large monoculture, typically no natural habitat around, very few wild insects are going to be there, but you can just bring a truck with a beehive, honeybee hive, and stick it in the field, and it will do the pollinating. And then when the bloom is done for that crop, put the box back on the truck and ship them off to some other place. So that's why honeybees are great for sort of the industrial way that we do agriculture. There are a few other species that are used. So there's bumblebees are used for some kinds of agriculture, particularly for greenhouse crops, specifically tomatoes and peppers and eggplants. So all of those related fruits require bumblebees to visit them to be pollinated properly, because they need to be buzz pollinated, and only bumblebees, well, I shouldn't say only bumblebees, but bumblebees are basically the best at that, and honeybees are not good at that. There's some other crops where wild bees are actually far better pollinators than honeybees, but they're not managed. We haven't found a way to manage them as effectively as honeybees. I guess there's two other groups that are managed a little bit. One is the alkali bee, which is used for alfalfa pollination, and in the Western US and Canada, it can be induced to nest in large densities near alfalfa fields. And then there's also some cavity nesting bees, so these ones that will nest in holes in wood, that you can build basically hotels for. So the alfalfa leafcutter bee is one, and then there's some orchard pollinators that are developed for pollination of certain crops.
Cool, thank you. Nicole asks, what species of at-risk bees have you encountered in the Ottawa region, and what are their nesting behaviors?
So I'm gonna, again, I'll touch on that in a little bit. So we do have some bumblebees in our area that are at risk, and unfortunately, we still have really poor knowledge of their nesting preferences. So I cannot tell you what specifically they're looking for in a nesting cavity. All I can tell you is that they're cavity nesters, and so they're looking for some kind of hole. I'm sorry, that's not very helpful. But basically, just if you can allow your garden to be a bit messy, that's the most likely to allow them to nest.
Cool, thank you. Another question, when do you start to see tube bees?
Is that referring to the mating or two bees?
I'm not sure.
Okay, we might need clarification on that one.
I think From what I understand from this question is it seems that someone was able to make bee houses and they made their own tubes and they were just wondering when they should start to see bees from those houses. Or
Oh, tube bees.
yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't hear it. They emerged, some of them have emerged already. Actually, yeah, so all of the mason bees have emerged already, but leafcutter bees will be coming out a bit later, like probably late June, July.
Cool. So keep an eye out soon then. Awesome. Another question from Teresa, who's 7, and she's wondering, are hoverflies pollinators?
Yes, they're really good pollinators.
Good to know.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few more questions here, and then maybe we can move on to the next section.
Okay.
But Leanne is wondering, she's currently building a honeybee in her yard, and she's been planting a variety of perennials so that there's always something in bloom for them. But she's wondering if there's specific things that she should not do or add to the bee yard.
Pesticides, that's probably pretty obvious. Yeah, nothing comes. Well, I will be giving a few tips about what to plant, super vague, probably nothing that that you don't already know, but yeah, I'll mention a little bit.
Sounds good.
Yeah,
Erin's wondering, what are the main bees that use bee hotels?
Yeah, so as I think I mentioned, it's a minority of bees. So most bees are nesting in the ground, not in those hotels. But the ones that will use the hotels are mason bees and leafcutter bees. So I'm just gonna, of the images I have here, this is a kind of mason bee. Some of them are quite beautiful and iridescent. Some of them are a bit more just black. This is a leafcutter bee. Both of these kinds of bees you can recognize by the fact that even though you can't see it on this one, they carry pollen on the underside of their abdomen, unlike the bees that carry it on their legs. So mason bees and leafcutter bees are the main ones, but you'll also get some of those yellow-faced bees, the ones that look kind of waspy, and they're fairly small, and they're always mostly black with a little bit of yellow marking on them.
Cool, thank you. Malad is wondering if there's major restoration projects to recover the bee populations across Ontario, or if there's areas that they can visit and see different types of bee species, if that's applicable.
I don't know of any major restoration projects, but there's lots of little local restoration projects where you can actually see quite a surprising diversity of pollinators. I think that's one of the nice things about working with insects, and the fact that there are just so many species that most people don't really notice, is that actually if you do stop and pay attention, and if you even give them a little patch of resources, you will start to see them. I think with more and more community groups doing pollinator gardens, that at least it's not going to bring back really endangered species, but at least it will support local populations of some of the common species. The other thing I will say, and I don't know, I don't have much hope with the current Ontario government, but one day I hope that governments throughout the world will move away from the mown road margins and start allowing more wildflowers in road margins and medians and so on. And maybe things are going that way in general. Again, that's not a huge thing to do, but I think would make a difference.
Sharon is wondering, what are the natural predators of native bee species?
Yeah, there's a whole range of things. So certainly birds will eat some bees until they learn not to. There are, spiders for sure will eat some bees, particularly crab spiders, which like to hang out in flowers and catch bees when they come to the flowers. Some mammals will dig up bumblebee hives, so skunks or badgers, which we don't have here, will dig those up. But the main predators are other insects and particularly other bees. So the parasitic bees are actually, they can be a major source of mortality for non-parasitic bees. And there's a bunch of parasitic wasps, which can be major sources of mortality as well. And then going even smaller, there's a bunch of fungi, like molds and yeasts and so on, that will grow in bee nests. And sometimes they don't cause any harm. Sometimes they're even beneficial to the bees, but sometimes they kill the bees.
Good to know. Madison, age 11, asks, what is affecting the bee population the most?
It's a wonderful question, but I'm going to exactly try to answer that like in 2 slides, I think. So
yeah, that sounds good.
I will get to that.
Cool. Maybe I'll take 2 more questions then, and then I can continue the rest of the questions afterwards.
Okay.
Awesome. Emily is asking that Emily's been trying to add bees that they find onto iNaturalist.
Oh, great.
They're wondering if you can suggest an ID key to help identify Ontario bees.
Good question, but there's no Ontario specific one. There's no general guide to all of the Ontario bees. There's too many species and they're too hard to tell apart. Now, bumblebees, there are resources. There's a great book that's been made available, like it's available as a PDF online for free, for the bumblebees of Eastern North America. It's maybe not the most user-friendly, but it does have all the species and all their color patterns, and you can figure them out. For the other bees, my best advice, other than like becoming a scientist and like, you know, having a microscope and taxonomic keys, is the website Discover Life. They have some online keys, and you can select what region you're in, so that can narrow down the choice of species a bit. It's reasonably good for the eastern US and not too bad for Eastern Canada.
Awesome.
I guess, sorry, I just one more thing on that. If you have seen the book, Bees in Your Backyard, that's a great resource. It's for all of North America, so it includes a lot of species that we don't have here, but it does have range maps, so you can at least know if what you're looking at is relevant.
Cool, awesome. It seems like in the chat there's been some people suggesting other websites to take a look at too.
Oh, great. That's wonderful.
That's awesome to hear. And then last question for this part, and then I'll add the other questions at the end. But what or who are better pollinators, bees or flies?
Oh, by asking that, you could start a war between the bee people and the fly people. This is such a divisive topic. So overall, globally, I'm going to go with bees, but that, you know, I'm a bee person. So fly people would say, well, so the truth is it depends. In parts of the world and for certain plant species, flies are going to be more important. And for many plant species and many parts of the world, bees are going to be more important. So I hope that's an adequate answer.
No, that makes sense. It makes people happy. Awesome. I'll let you continue with your presentation. Okay. And then if anyone else has any other questions, just put them in the chat and we'll ask them at the end.
Okay, so the question I get asked most often is, how are the bees doing? And my unsatisfactory answer is that it depends which bees you're talking about, because some bees are doing fine. And I want to clear this up. So I think one could get the impression that honeybees are endangered from, you know, the way sometimes the media talk about this. So I want to show you some actual data on the number of beehives. That's what's shown on the y-axis here. So it's on the left-hand axis, it's the number of beehives in Canada or the US, and on the right-hand axis, it's the number of beehives in the world over time, so years on the x-axis. And you can see that for the world in green here, the number of beehives is steadily increasing. In Canada, it's been mostly slightly increasing over time. In the US, there's been a long-term decline, but in recent years, that's not apparent. Now, number of beehives is not exactly equal to the number of bees. This doesn't tell the whole story. So this is the number of beehives that beekeepers know about. So it doesn't include wild feral hives, and it doesn't account for the number of individual bees in a hive. But still, we're talking about 100 million beehives in the world. So this is not an endangered species. If you're curious about this drop here in the US in the 80s, that was when varroa mites arrived in North America. Usually they attack the larvae, but this is a picture of one on an adult honeybee. They're quite large and they can transmit other diseases. So these have been a major problem for beekeepers, and they continue to be a problem. But they caused this major drop in the 80s. When people started talking about colony collapse in the early 2000s, or I guess, yeah, maybe 13 years ago it started, that was a relatively minor blip in the bee trends overall. So honeybees are not endangered, but it is true that demand for pollinators for crops has been growing faster than the supply has been growing. Next question is, are native bees endangered? And here too, the answer kind of is, it depends, because some species definitely are. But unfortunately, it's only the bumblebees that we have really good data on. So for most species of bees, we just don't have enough information over time to be able to say to what extent they've declined, if at all. Within the bumblebees, some species are doing fine. And so the species you're most likely to have seen this spring is the common eastern bumblebee. It's been doing great. It seems to do relatively well in cities. And so if anything, it's been increasing in abundance over the last decades. But other species of bumblebees have been really declining. And the saddest case of that is the rusty-patched bumblebee, which used to be common in these parts and now is probably extinct in Canada and is very rare in North America. We do still have yellow-banded bumblebees around here, and I have seen one in downtown Ottawa, but they've become quite uncommon. So if you can do anything to promote bumblebee habitat in your area, and by that I just mean providing flowers and potential cavities for them to nest in, this is a species that you might potentially be helping. So the main threats to native bees, to answer the question that I was asked before, I believe it's still true that the main threat for bees, as for most wild animals, is loss of habitat. So conversion of land to agriculture or other forms of land disturbance is the main problem. That tends to go along with other threats. So conversion of land to agriculture typically brings along the use of pesticides, including insecticides, such as the neonicotinoids, which we know are a big problem for bees. Pathogens and parasites are an issue, and particularly there have been some introduced pathogens and parasites, some of which have come with moving bees around for agriculture. And so we don't have a fully complete picture of the impact of these things. This is something that people have only begun to study really in the last 10 or 15 years, I would say, with wild bees. The other thing that's been increasingly studied, and I would say there's increasing evidence that this is important, is climate change. It's still not on the level of the impact of habitat loss, but of course it's getting increasingly severe and it interacts with habitat loss. So if bees don't have habitat that they can, bees and other animals have habitat that they can disperse through to move northward or upward in elevation to keep track with changing climate, then they're even more likely to become endangered. And then finally, the last one I've put on here is competition. And I don't know how big a threat this is. It's been hard to document, but honeybees are not native to this region, and they do consume a lot of pollen and nectar. So I'm going to suggest to you that they are potentially competing with native bees. They're not the only introduced species, but they're the big one. So what you can do, some of this is not going to be news to those of you who would come to this seminar, but I'll say it anyway. Advocate for habitat preservation in whatever form that comes, and support local and small-scale agriculture. If it can be organic, that's great. That's probably best, but I don't want to be too dogmatic about that, because there are lots of growers that are very conscious about how they use pesticides, really keep pesticide use to a minimum, and try to apply it in ways that are bee friendly. So yeah, so I wouldn't completely censure small scale growers that are doing their best, but occasionally use pesticides or have not yet got organic certification. But the small scale thing is important because it means that you're leaving patches of land, even if it's just a strip of trees or shrubs along the edge of a farm field, where wild pollinators and other beneficial insects can live. It also means that you can have a patchwork of different kinds of crops that can be supporting different kinds of insects. More locally, what you can do in your garden, for example, or if you have a community garden, or if there's some place in the city where you have some influence that you could cause it to be converted to a pollinator garden, you can provide resources for wild pollinators. And it's really not that hard. There's so many flowers out there, so many native plants that bees will use. So really all you need is flowers that are going to produce nectar and pollen. And that's not all flowers, since, you know, cultivars of roses, for example, some have been bred to just produce petals, and so they don't produce pollen anymore. So stay away from those and opt for things like wild roses instead. You want to have a variety of different plants so they're blooming at different times in the season. Preferably plants that are native to Eastern North America. They'll be hardier, they're more likely to have an evolutionary history with the bees in our region, so they're more likely to be suitable food for them. But there's non-native plants that bees are perfectly happy to take pollen and nectar from. And plants that are pesticide free. And I know that getting plants that haven't been treated with neonicotinoids at some stage can be challenging, but there's some resources I'll point you to later that can get you to some sources of native pesticide-free plants. Okay, so that's the flower part. The other part, oh, I forgot. So this is an example, because my garden, I just moved into my house last year. My garden is a work in progress, but there are people doing amazing things with tiny spaces in the city. So this is images from Berit Erickson's webpage, and she has this website called Corner Pollinator Garden. And she started out with this boring patch of lawn in 2015. And in 2 short years, she transformed it into this amazing patch of pollinator habitat. And it's improved since then. But I thought this was remarkable. And if you don't believe me, it's the same little patch. Notice this tree here, it's the same little tree. She's just managed to surround it with flowers. So she has some great resources. But in addition to flowers, there's nesting habitat. And I don't have good images here of nesting habitat because most nesting habitat is not photogenic. It's mostly underground. So just leaving some undisturbed soil is actually the best thing you can do for most bees. And it maybe doesn't make you feel really good because it doesn't involve you doing anything, but that's actually the best thing for a lot of bees. And then you can also provide nesting cavities and stems for the 30% or so of bees that are nesting above ground. And to show you a couple of examples, and again, I'm sure many of you have seen these kinds of things because they're increasingly marketed. So I know like Lee Valley and even Costco are selling bee hotels, but you can make your own. So this is a design. I pulled this image off the City of Ottawa website, but this is a design that works amazingly well, and that is used at the Fletcher Wildlife Garden in Ottawa. And so if you go to those links, which I can share with everyone afterwards, there's instructions on how to build this kind of design. This is from the City of Ottawa's new pollinator garden. So it's just a bunch of hollow stems and holes drilled in wood. And then this is also at the Fletcher Wildlife Garden with a bunch of different types of habitat. So the question that was asked earlier about, are we doing more harm than good by putting these things out and not cleaning them? It's a good question. So as I mentioned before, I wouldn't assume that you're going to be hugely benefiting wild pollinator populations by putting this habitat out. But I will say these things are a great educational tool. It is super neat to watch the bees do their thing, coming and going, bringing the pollen and nectar and bits of leaf and whatever they do to build their nests. So it can really, I think their purpose is a little bit more educational than conservation. I don't think they're doing net harm, but they may not be doing very much net good. But they're still really neat. Okay, and so then I just, again, wanted to emphasize that natural nesting habitat, so just allowing uncut stems and old dead wood, you know, again, it doesn't allow you to feel like you're really doing something active to save bees, but it's probably even more effective than these artificial nesting structures. So the last thing is avoid harming native bees. So I think this is pretty obvious. Don't use pesticides in your property. The other thing is avoid over gardening. So if you can restrain yourself from tidying up too much and cutting back old stems, that would be helpful. You can avoid working all of the soil too much or covering over soil with a whole lot of new soil. That will allow any overwintering ground nesting bees to get out and nest there again. And finally, and most controversially, I'm going to say, please avoid keeping honeybees. And I know some of you probably already do, and I'm not saying stop. I'm just saying don't take up honeybee keeping because you think it's going to save wild bees. If you're going to do it because they're interesting animals and you like honey, but it's not saving the wild bee population. It would be sort of like keeping chickens in order to save the wild birds. They're not really wildlife. They're not native to here. They're not part of this ecosystem. They're kind of like livestock. Okay, it's so great that I'm doing this on Zoom. You guys can't throw tomatoes at me or whatever you might want to do for my having said that. I'm going to give you a little bit of data to back that up. So consider the fact that a healthy honeybee hive collects between 2.5 and 9 kilos of pollen per month. And in 3 months, a single hive removes from the ecosystem enough pollen and nectar to raise 110,000 solitary bees. So it seems inevitable that introducing honeybees to the ecosystem is going to have some negative impact on native bees. So again, I would encourage you to just support native bees and get into honeybee keeping as a way to save our ecosystems. Okay, so that's basically it. Take-home messages. Our wild pollinators are important. They're beautiful. They're diverse. There are lots of them even here in Eastern Ontario, so just keep an eye out for them this summer and try to appreciate them. And then finally, keeping the bees can be interesting and rewarding, but it is not saving the bees. So that's it, except I just wanted to put in a little plug for the Wild Pollinator Partners, which is an organization started by some friends of mine, and I've been very slightly involved with it. It focuses on Eastern Ontario and the Outaouais region, but the resources on here would be totally relevant for the Kingston area as well. And there's great links on here for where to get native plant seed, where to get native plants, how to build bee nesting habitat, and there's a blog with features about pollinator gardening and about individual pollinator species and so on. So if you're interested in this stuff, you can check it out. And with that, I'd be happy to take any remaining questions.
Thank you so much, Jessica. This has been very informative. At least I've learned a lot, so I really appreciate it. I have a few questions just from before, and then I'll let you know if more start rolling in. But one person was wondering how we can encourage the bees who live underground.
Yeah, you know, it's mainly don't do too much. And I know that doesn't sound very satisfactory, but let me tell you a little anecdote. I have this window box on my back deck. So it's on the second floor, so it's, you know, raised a good distance above the ground. It's lined with plastic. I didn't put it in, it was here with the house. And the neighborhood cats like to use it as a litter box. So it's covered in cat poop. And I thought at a certain point, I got to clean this out. It's disgusting. I started cleaning out the cat poop. And then I started noticing all of these little bees arriving with pollen on their legs. And what had happened was there were bees nesting under that cat poop. And by removing the cat poop, I had made it impossible for them to find their nests. They had been using the cat poop as landmarks to find where their nest entrance was. And so by disturbing the soil surface in that way, they were stuck. They were just hovering there over the window box, not knowing what to do, not knowing where to deposit their pollen because I had disturbed their home. So, I mean, maybe one day, like over the winter or something, I will get rid of the cat poop or try again to get rid of the cat poop. But the message is just try to leave some areas of the garden that are undisturbed. And some bees like bare soil. Some are perfectly happy to nest under mulch. They use all different kinds of habitat. And in fact, it's something we're still studying now to figure out what different kinds of bees prefer.
Good to know. Ellen was wondering if you had any recommendations for sourcing native plants to best support bees.
Yeah, so I cannot remember the names of anything, but check out the Wild Pollinator Partners resources page, and there are great local resources for exactly that.
Awesome, thank you. Ellen, if you're looking for looking at plants specifically, I know Kingston has a few gardening centers that just source native plants. So if you're to Google like Kingston Gardening Centers native, then hopefully there might be a few that come up because I know that that's what we're looking into for our pollinator gardens. William was also wondering how long you have been studying bees.
14 years.
Impressive.
Yeah.
Awesome. And then Johanna, again, I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name, but was wondering if you knew of any projects needing volunteers in bees conservation research, and they're located in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
Oh, there are bee people at the University of Manitoba. Jason Gibbs and Kyle Bobbywash, I think, are the two. I think they're both at the University of Manitoba. They would be the people to contact there. And if they're not doing conservation projects, they would know people who are.
Good to know. Yeah. Thank you. Sarah has a question that she asked you earlier, but she's wondering, where do bees sleep?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is I love this question. So female bees mostly sleep in their nests. So they go back to their nests, a nice safe place, enclosed, and they'll generally sleep facing out. So they're prepared to confront any threat and ready to get going in the morning. Male bees don't have that option because they don't build a nest for themselves. So male bees often, not always, but often sleep in flowers. And I just find that wonderfully cute. There's even a bee species called Chilostoma florisomni, florisomni meaning it sleeps in flowers. Now, male bees will sometimes just find other safe places. So sometimes we find them like in the cavities in wood that females nest in. Males will also hang out in there when it's cold weather or whatever. And they don't close their eyes, so we don't actually know that they're sleeping, but they sure seem to be in a sleepy state.
Good to know, thank you. That's all the questions I had. It's just a lot of people saying thank you so much. So
Oh,
I'll
that's
do
nice.
that and say thank you. We really appreciate you being here and coming to speak to us. I know, again, I said this, but I've learned a lot, and it sounds like a lot of other people have too. So thank you. Those who are still in the call, Cubes is actually running Eco Adventure Camp, and so I know that I've noticed that there's been a lot of like children and families and parents and guardians in the seminar. And so if you're interested in learning more about ecology, then definitely check out Eco Adventure Camp. Their website is ecoadventurecamp.ca. So check that out. I'm sure it'll be an awesome time. And again, if you guys want to learn more about Elbow Lake's pollinator gardens, then we'll have information on our social media, which is Elbow Lake EEC. And then if you want to learn more about Jessica, then if you just Google her name, her website will come up and you'll be able to keep updated with her lab. I think that's all from us. So thank you so much for everyone for attending and for spending your Thursday evening with us as we learn about bees and pollinators.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. And thanks for the invitation again.
Thank you.
And for the great questions.